Ever feel like your brain's running on two different speeds? Like sometimes it's lightning fast, other times it's stuck in the slow lane. Well, get ready to unpack that because we're diving into thinking fast and slow. Daniel Kahneman is taking us on a wild ride through the ups and downs, the shortcuts, and the dead ends of our own minds. And trust me, this is one deep dive you don't want to miss.
No kidding. Kahneman and his research partner, Amos Tversky, they were like the dynamic duo of psychology, turning the world of behavioral science on its head. They wanted to understand these weird, sometimes kind of funny ways our minds work. And boy, did they uncover some surprising stuff.
Okay, so Kahneman kicks things off with this idea of two systems of thinking. System one, that's your quick draw, shoot from the hip kind of thinking. Like you see a picture of someone with a face like thunder, you just get angry. No need to overthink it.
Right. Or try this, so it's 2 plus 2. See, you didn't even break a mental sweat. That's system one in action. It's all about instinct, those gut reactions, the stuff we do without really, thinking. But then there's system two. It's more like, let me ponder that for a second.
The slow and steady wins the race kind of thinking.
Yeah. System two steps in when we're solving a tricky puzzle, planning a project. Those times you actually feel the wheels turning. It's slower, more deliberate, but hey, sometimes we need that extra brain power, right?
And speaking of needing that extra brain power, remember that invisible gorilla experiment where people are so busy watching a basketball being passed around, they completely miss a dude in a gorilla suit just strolling through the scene.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Talk about a mind-blowing experiment.
It's wild, right? Like, how can you miss a gorilla? But that's our brains on autopilot. System one's got us focused on one thing. System two's kind of snoozing at the wheel, and boom, gorilla blindness.
It shows how our attention is actually a pretty limited resource. And we think we're taking it all in, but our brains are constantly filtering, prioritizing. It's like our own little mental highlight reel, choosing what makes the cut and what gets left on the cutting room floor.
Fascinating stuff, but kind of scary too, right? Like, what else are we missing while our brains are busy focusing on the wrong things?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
And then Kahneman throws another curveball priming. This one's seriously trippy. It's like just hearing a certain word or seeing a certain image can totally mess with your actions without you even realizing it.
It's wild, isn't it? Like you read a bunch of words about being old, suddenly you're walking slower, or, get this, you lie on the phone, then you're more likely to reach for mouthwash. But tell a lie in an email, bam, you want soap. It's like this weird subconscious link between feeling morally icky and wanting to physically scrub yourself clean.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, they call it the Lady Macbeth effect.
Yeah.
Our brains are making these crazy connections without us even knowing.
I don't know about that. That just sounds too out there. Like, I feel like I'm in control of my own actions,
Oh, I hear you. It's hard to wrap your head around, right? But there's a ton of research on this stuff. It's not about mind control or anything. It's more like our unconscious minds are calling the shots more often than we realize.
So it's like we're all just puppets on a string.
No, not at all. It's more like realizing there's a whole lot going on under the surface, influencing our thoughts, feelings, choices, things we're not even aware of.
Okay, I'm starting to see what you mean. But how does this play out in the real world? Like, what's an example of this priming thing actually affecting people's behavior?
Well, picture this. They did this experiment with a coffee station, right? People paid for their drinks using an honesty box. Simple enough.
Right.
But then they put a picture of eyes above the honesty box. Just a picture, nothing else changed. And guess what?
People suddenly decided to be more honest.
Exactly. Just having those eyes watching them, even though it was just a picture, made a huge difference in how much money people put in the box.
No way. You're kidding.
Nope. It's called the honesty box experiment. It shows how even subtle cues can trigger these unconscious responses. Like, deep down, we want to be seen as good, honest people.
Wild.
Right. And that unconscious desire can be triggered by the simplest things. Our brains are constantly picking up on these signals, even if we're not aware of it.
It's like our brains are hardwired to find patterns, even when they don't exist. We see a couple of random events and can't help but weave a whole story around them.
Exactly. We crave meaning. And our brains are kind of obsessed with connecting the dots, even if those dots are like light years apart. And that's where things can get a little messy because Kahneman argues that this tendency to see patterns everywhere, to think we've got it all figured out, well, that's a one-way ticket to overconfident city. Population. Most of us.
Ouch. Yeah, I think we've all been there at some point, thinking we've got it all under control, only to realize, nope, not even close.
Happens to the best of us. We overestimate our skills, our knowledge, our chances of winning the lottery. you name it. Remember that time you were absolutely positively sure you were right about something? And then...
reality came knocking with a big ol' reality check. Been there, done that.
Exactly. Kahneman says we need a bigger dose of humility when it comes to our own judgment. We need to acknowledge the role of chance, of luck, of plain old randomness in our lives, because sometimes things just happen, you know?
Right. It's not always about our brilliant plans or amazing abilities. Sometimes it's just the universe doing its thing. And speaking of things not always going according to plan, Kahneman also dives into how our choices often stray from those perfectly rational models economists love to talk about.
Yeah, those models where everyone's a perfectly rational being, making decisions based on logic and maximizing their gains.
Yeah, those ones.
They're great in theory, but in the real world, not so much. We humans are messy, emotional creatures, and our decisions often reflect that. And that's where Kahneman's prospect theory comes in. It explains why we sometimes make choices that seem, on the surface, kind of irrational.
Irrational, like, I don't know, refusing a bet where you have a 50-50 chance of either winning or losing $100.
Exactly. Logically, it's a wash, right? Equal chances of winning or losing the same amount.
Right.
But for most people, the thought of losing that $100, way more painful than the joy of winning it.
It's like that saying, the pain of a loss is twice as powerful as the pleasure of a gain, or something like that.
Exactly. Loss aversion. It's a real thing. Think about how much harder it is to give up that parking spot you circled for like an hour, even if it means being late, compared to the relief of finding one right away.
Oh, tell me about it. Or how about this, holding onto a stock that's tanking, hoping against hope it'll magically bounce back instead of just cutting your losses and moving on?
Classic loss aversion in action. We'd rather cling to the hope of recouping our losses, even if it means potentially losing even more. And then there's framing effects, where just changing the way a choice is presented can totally flip our decision-making switch, even if the options themselves are exactly the same.
Okay, now that one sounds kind of hard to believe. Got an example?
Sure. Let's say you need a medical treatment, right? You could be told it has a 90% success rate, or you could be told it has a 10% failure rate.
Same thing, different packaging.
Exactly. But which one sounds more appealing?
The 90% success rate, for sure.
Right. Even though, statistically speaking, they're identical.
Wow, so it's like our brains are being tricked by words.
In a way, yes. We're swayed by the way information is presented, even when we think we're being all logical and level-headed. Our emotions have a sneaky way of coloring our judgment, even when we're not aware of it.
So with all these biases and this irrational behavior, is Kahneman saying we're all doomed to make bad decisions? Like, is there any hope for us?
Not at all. He's the first to admit that he falls prey to these biases himself.
It's human nature, right? The key takeaway here isn't about achieving some kind of perfect rationality. It's about awareness. By understanding how our minds work, those quirks and shortcuts our brains love to take, we can start to catch ourselves in the act.
So it's like knowing our enemies. Exactly. Once you know your enemy, you can start to anticipate their moves.
Right. Makes sense. So we've got System 1 and System 2 duking it out in our heads, all these biases tripping us up. How do we actually use this knowledge to make better choices?
Well, that's what we'll unpack in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've got System 1 and System 2 battling it out, these biases lurking around every corner. But Kahneman doesn't stop there. He throws another mind bender our way. The two selves. The experiencing self and the remembering self. Say what now?
Yeah, this is where things get really meta. So imagine this. Your experiencing self, that's you in the moment, feeling all the feels, right? The joy of a perfect cup of coffee, the frustration of rush hour traffic, the thrill of a roller coaster ride.
Okay, I'm with you so far. Living life in real time.
Exactly. But then there's your remembering self. This version of you steps back and says, okay, what's the story here? How do I make sense of all that? It's the part of us that creates the narrative of our lives, the highlight reel, or maybe the lowlight reel, that we carry around with us.
So like the experiencing self is living life in HD, full sensory overload, and the remembering self is creating the Instagram post.
Perfect analogy. Except, here's the catch. Those two selves, they don't always see eye to eye. The remembering self, it tends to fixate on the peak moments, the most intense parts of an experience, and how it all ended. Kahneman calls this the peak end rule.
Which explains so much, right? Like, you go on this amazing vacation, but the flight home is a total nightmare, delayed, cramped seats, lost luggage, the whole 9 yards, and suddenly the whole trip feels kind of tainted.
Exactly. Or you go through a painful medical procedure, but the doctor cracks a joke at the end, and suddenly the whole thing seems less traumatic in retrospect.
Hmm.
It's like our memories are less about the actual experience and more about the story we tell ourselves about it.
Wow. So we've got these two selves, both kind of flawed in their own ways, fighting for control of our life story. It's no wonder we humans are such complex creatures. But if our brains are constantly taking shortcuts, our memories are unreliable, and we're all susceptible to these biases, how do we make sense of anything? How do we make good choices?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But that's what makes Kahneman's work so important. He's not offering us a magic formula for perfect rationality because, let's face it, that doesn't exist. He's giving us something even more valuable: awareness.
Awareness of our own limitations.
Exactly. The first step is simply recognizing that these biases exist, that we all fall prey to them, and that our intuition, our gut feelings, they're not always to be trusted. We have to be willing to question our own assumptions, to seek out different perspectives, and to slow down, engage that slower, more deliberate system two thinking, especially when we're making important decisions.
So it's not about trying to become some kind of Spock-like, perfectly rational being. It's about working with what we've got, quirks and all.
Exactly. It's about understanding the tools we have, both the strengths and the weaknesses, and using them to the best of our ability. And hey, recognizing our limitations, that's a sign of intelligence too, right?
Right. So to our listeners out there, next time you're faced with a tough choice, remember those two systems duking it out in your head. Think about those biases that might be subtly shaping your view, and don't be afraid to hit the pause button, challenge your own thinking, and channel your inner skeptic.
Love that. And remember, even the smartest among us make mistakes, fall for those cognitive traps. It's part of what makes us human.
Absolutely. Well, that's our deep dive into Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, a book that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about your own mind. We hope you enjoyed the journey. Until next time, keep those mental gears turning, and remember sometimes a little bit of self-doubt can be a good thing.